For years, researchers who study how wealth accumulates kept running into the same problem. The data wasn't behaving the way it was supposed to. Income explained some of the gap, but not nearly as much as expected. Education helped, but inconsistently. And financial literacy, how well someone actually understood interest rates and compound growth, turned out to be surprisingly disconnected from real outcomes. People who knew the most about money weren't reliably the ones building it. That finding alone was strange enough to make researchers stop. But what they found next was stranger. When they looked closely at the people on either end of the gap, two very different pictures emerged. On one side, people with ordinary incomes, no financial background, no particular expertise, quietly building stability over time. On the other side, people with high incomes, good education, genuine financial knowledge, barely staying ahead. The standard explanations didn't fit. So the researchers started looking somewhere else entirely. They started looking at time, not compound interest, not long-term investment strategy, not the dramatic, once-in-a-decade decisions most people associate with financial turning points. Something much smaller. A specific window inside the week. What people did or didn't do during one recurring moment every 7 days. The pattern that eventually emerged didn't fit neatly into any existing theory about discipline or sacrifice. It was quieter than any of those things, and far more ordinary than anyone expected. Every Sunday evening, Michael did something that took him about 6 minutes. He didn't think of it as important. He never mentioned it to anyone. It had simply become part of the rhythm of his week, the way certain habits do when practiced long enough that they stop feeling like decisions at all. He would open his banking app, look at what had come in that week, what had gone out, notice anything that felt slightly off. Then, he'd close the app and go about the rest of his evening. 6 minutes. No spreadsheet, no system, no financial expertise required. He had no idea that researchers studying decades of wealth accumulation would eventually identify this kind of behavior as one of the most financially predictive patterns they could find. To understand why something so ordinary could matter so much, you first have to understand what works against it. Because the absence of this habit isn't laziness. It isn't irresponsibility. It is, in most cases, something the brain does automatically. Almost invisibly. Psychologists have a name for it. The ostrich effect. When information carries the possibility of discomfort, when a number might be lower than hoped, when a balance might confirm something hovering at the edge of awareness, the brain doesn't always respond rationally. It avoids. Not dramatically, not through any conscious decision. There's no moment where a person sits down and deliberately chooses not to check their finances. It's quieter than that. The thought simply doesn't arise with any urgency. The app stays closed. The statement sits in the inbox. Days become weeks, and weeks become months, and all the while, life continues at whatever financial pace it was already moving. Because behavior without feedback repeats itself. When researchers began studying this avoidance pattern closely, they found something that complicated the picture. They had assumed avoidance was mostly concentrated among people in genuine financial difficulty. The data told a different story. Avoidance was widespread, across income levels, across education levels, across people who considered themselves financially responsible, and people who didn't. The discomfort that triggered avoidance wasn't always about crisis. Sometimes it was just uncertainty, the low-level anxiety that comes from not being entirely sure what the numbers would show. The quiet awareness that things had been a little loose lately. That was enough. Enough to push the idea of looking toward next week. And then the week after that. And here is what the researchers found most significant. The habit of not looking, once established, continued, even when things improved. Avoidance, like attention, becomes its own pattern. And patterns, in financial life as in most of life, produce results that compound over time. There is a particular feeling that comes with financial avoidance that most people recognize immediately once it's described. It shows up when you reach for your phone, notice the banking app, and feel your thumb move past it toward something else. Not a choice exactly, just a subtle redirection. It shows up when a statement notification arrives, and you glance at it long enough to register what it is, but not long enough to actually open it. You tell yourself you'll look later. When you have more time, later never quite arrives. The feeling isn't panic. It's quieter than panic. It's the awareness that looking might confirm something you'd rather not know yet. That opening the app means facing a number that could require you to change something, admit something, or feel something you're not ready to feel. So you don't look. And the not looking doesn't feel like a failure in the moment. It feels like relief. Temporary, small, almost unnoticeable. But relief, nonetheless. The problem is that relief comes with a cost that only becomes visible later. Because while you're not looking, life continues. Subscriptions renew. Small purchases accumulate. The gap between what you think is happening and what is actually happening widens, slowly and silently. And then the avoidance makes sense in retrospect. Of course you didn't want to look. What doesn't make sense until much later is that not looking is what allowed this to become what it became. Michael had experienced those uncomfortable Sundays. There were evenings when the numbers weren't good, when a week of unplanned expenses had left the balance lower than he'd expected. He didn't solve anything in those moments. He didn't make dramatic resolutions. He just looked. Then he closed the app. But something had registered, some quiet, low-level awareness that would carry into the week ahead. That would sit behind decisions he'd never consciously connect back to that Sunday evening. Behavioral economists, studying what they called financial attention, found a consistent pattern. People who maintained a habit of regular financial awareness made decisions, on average, that were closer to their own stated intentions. Not because they were more disciplined, but because awareness, refreshed regularly, introduced something into the decision-making process that was otherwise absent. A background orientation, a faint but present sense of where things actually stood. When a person has looked at their financial situation recently, that awareness exists somewhere behind every small decision that follows. Not loudly, not as a conscious calculation, but present enough to create a barely perceptible pause in decisions that would otherwise have no pause at all. And that pause, repeated across hundreds of decisions over months and years, produces results that look, in retrospect, like discipline. But it isn't discipline in the way most people imagine discipline. It is the quiet, downstream effect of having looked. Behavioral economists have a term for the force working against this: present bias. The human brain, by design, weights the immediate moment far more heavily than the future. A decision made right now is evaluated against how it feels right now, not against how it fits into the month, just this moment. When there is no recent awareness behind a decision, present bias operates without any counterweight. The future never quite arrives in the room when the decision is being made. The immediate wins by default. But regular attention changes the internal math, slightly and consistently, by simply making the present feel slightly more connected to the future. In one study, researchers tracked financial behavior during a period of significant market volatility. They expected to find panic. What they found instead was something quieter. A large portion of the people they were tracking didn't panic. They disengaged. Account logins dropped. Statements went unopened. People who had previously been attentive simply stopped looking. From the outside, this looked like patience. But the researchers followed these same people through the months that followed. And what emerged changed how they understood the entire question. The people who had looked away didn't just avoid the discomfort of watching balances decline. They became absent from their own financial lives. They missed things they would otherwise have caught. They made passive decisions through inaction during a period when small, deliberate choices could have mattered considerably. Avoidance hadn't protected them. It had simply removed them from the picture. Here's something researchers didn't expect to find. When they studied people who checked their financial accounts frequently, daily or multiple times per day, they found something counterintuitive. Those people didn't build wealth faster than people who checked weekly. In many cases, they built it slower. The constant checking created what the researchers called monitoring anxiety, a low-grade stress that made every small fluctuation feel significant. The daily checkers were more likely to make reactive decisions, to overcorrect. The weekly checkers, by contrast, had enough distance to see patterns without getting lost in noise. Enough proximity to notice drift. Enough space to avoid turning awareness into anxiety. It turned out there was a sweet spot, not so infrequent that reality became abstract, not so constant that attention became obsession, just regular enough to stay oriented. There was a freelancer named Jessica whose income changed every month. Some months were good, some months were tight. There was no predictable rhythm to rely on. For years, she avoided looking at her accounts during the lean months. It felt pointless. The number would be low. She already knew that. Looking wouldn't change it. So she didn't. But what she didn't realize was that the months she avoided looking were the months when small problems quietly became larger ones. A subscription she'd forgotten about. An automatic payment she hadn't accounted for. It was only after a particularly difficult stretch that she started to see the pattern. The months she looked, even when the number was uncomfortable, were the months she caught things early. She'd notice a charge that didn't belong. Cancel something she wasn't using. Make one small adjustment that kept the month from becoming worse than it needed to be. The looking didn't fix the income volatility, but it kept the volatility from compounding into chaos. And over time, that difference changed everything. Not because she became more disciplined, but because she stopped letting discomfort make her absent from her own financial life. There is a pattern in how people who struggle financially tend to describe their own situation, not usually as recklessness. More often, with a phrase that appears, with striking consistency, across research interviews. I don't know where it went. Not defensively, as a genuinely accurate description of their experience. The money moved through their lives. And they weren't fully present for the movement. Not because they didn't care. Because they had never built the habit of watching. And money, like most things that move without being watched, moves in directions shaped by whatever forces are already in motion. What the researchers ultimately found, after years of tracking this pattern, was a conclusion that resisted being made complicated. The most consistent behavioral predictor of financial stability they could identify was not income. It was not financial literacy. It was not discipline in the conventional sense. It was the regularity with which a person maintained honest awareness of their own financial situation, how often they looked. Whether looking was something they did consistently, as a quiet and unremarkable part of the week, or something they did reactively, when circumstances eventually made looking unavoidable. The people who looked regularly weren't always making obviously better financial decisions. They were making all of their decisions in the presence of a slightly more accurate picture of where things stood. And that difference, applied to hundreds of decisions across years and decades, produced outcomes that looked like discipline, like talent, like some quality that set these people apart. The quality that set them apart was simpler than any of that. They were paying attention, consistently, before they had to. If this kind of thinking stays with you, the hidden patterns in how people relate to money, the small behaviors that quietly shape large outcomes, consider subscribing to Habit Wealth Stories. This is what we explore here. There will be a Sunday, sometime soon, when you'll reach for your phone. And somewhere in that moment, the thought will arrive. Not loudly, not with any urgency, just the quiet awareness that you could look at the account, at the balance, at where things actually stand right now. And in that moment, you'll have a choice that won't feel like a choice at all. Your thumb will move in one direction or another, toward the app or past it. And whichever direction it moves, nothing dramatic will happen. The balance will be whatever it is. The week will continue. But something will have been set in motion, or something will have been delayed. And the difference between those two paths won't be visible for a long time. Not until enough Sundays have passed, that the two versions of your financial life have quietly diverged. One where you always roughly knew, and one where you kept meaning to check. The researchers spent years trying to isolate what separated people who built stability from people who didn't. And what they found, in the end, was something that almost felt too simple to matter. The people who built stability were the ones who stayed close enough to their own reality to notice when things started to drift. Not because they were smarter, not because they cared more, but because they had made it a habit to look. And looking, it turned out, was enough. Not to solve everything, but enough to keep them present, enough to keep the corrections small, enough to move through years without ever arriving at the end of one, and wondering where it all went. They knew. They had always known. Because every week, for just a few minutes, they chose to look. And that choice, repeated quietly across a lifetime, became the difference.